Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for your patience while we get the slides up and running for today's webinar. My name is Jonathan Ruthier, and I'm the Executive Director for CSNI, which is the Association for New Hampshire's 10 Area Agencies. And thank you for joining our monthly webinar series today. Today's topic is called When the Bus Stops Coming, Transition Planning. And we are really excited to have Mindy Huckins here from Gateways Community Services, who's going to walk us through why transition planning is important, what does it involve, when the process should start, etc. Hopefully we are able to answer every question you could ever have, but inevitably during the webinars, things come up where people have questions, and the best way to submit those, because we're not doing an interactive webinar by voice, is for you to hover your mouse over either the top or bottom of your screen until you see a menu pop up. You'll see a little button that says Q&A, and if you click on that button, it will allow you to type in a question and hit send. We'll be monitoring those questions as they come in here at CSNI, and we'll make sure that we get to all of those questions before the end of the webinar today. So again, thank you for joining us, and without any further ado, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Mindy so she can get us started.
Right, so good afternoon, everyone. I am very excited to be here to share with you. As Jonathan said, I'm Mindy Huckins. I work for Gateways Community Services, and transition is my special interest. So I'm glad to be able to join all of you today for some information. So I just wanted to begin with
your arrow keys are
here we go, just moving the slide, there we go. So first, when we're going to talk about transition, it's probably best to start with what is it? And so what I've used here is the definition of transition as defined by the New Hampshire Standards for Education of Children with Disabilities in 2017. And this is probably the most general description to use because it's similar to what you'll experience in schools as well as in the community when we talk about transition at large. So it's good to have that. So transition in New Hampshire is defined as a coordinated set of events for a child with a disability that begins at age 14 or 16 at the latest. And it's designed to do a couple things. So I'll read through the definition and then I'll break it down and talk about it. The first one is that it's designed to be within a result-oriented process. The second is that it's focused on improving the child's academic and functional achievement. And it's supporting the child's movement from school to post-school activities, including the following 6 areas: post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, adult education, independent living, and community participation. So that was a mouthful, but what does it really mean in real life? So it's important to know that coordinated set of events means that it doesn't just happen. It's not something that just happens to you or for you. It's something that happens with you, and it needs to be coordinated. That doesn't mean that we don't respond to opportunities and change directions as things come up live, but for the most part, we want to work to have a coordinated set of events where we're really thinking about where do we want to go and how are we going to get there? What kind of things do we need to do along the way to make those things happen? And that's why it's called kind of a coordinated set of events. What we're trying to think about is where do we want to end up and how does every decision we make today, decision, opportunity, or skill development, lead us to where we want to be? It's kind of talking about that trajectory. So when we start with our vision of what is it we want, that's part of our thinking when we're doing transition planning. And how does each decision and opportunity help us get closer to that? Or does it perhaps make us get further away? Does it change that trajectory? And changing trajectory is not a bad thing. It's just something we want to do with intent. We want to be thinking about it. Did we change for a good reason? And make sure that it's not just happening because we didn't pay attention to it or kind of didn't think about the big picture of things. So then we kind of get into this next section, which is really why is transition planning important? And it's important to a lot of people and in a lot of systems and a lot of things. So this slide kind of breaks it down into 3 areas. Why is it important for the individual? Why is it important for the area agency system? And why is it important to our state and to our legislature? So first and foremost, to start with the individual is the center of everything we do here. And there's kind of a nice quote that says, goals are just dreams until you put action to them. So it's great to have goals and ideas, but they don't come to fruition on their own. We have to think about what are those goals and what actions are going to get us there. And so that's really important to the individual. The second is that action plans decrease anxiety. So I know for a lot of the transition folks that I've worked with, and families and caregivers and even professional teams around a student, not knowing what's coming in the future can raise a lot of anxiety for everybody. And so when we can meet and we can put action steps towards things and we can talk about them, those anxieties, those worries are not something you have to manage on your own. And having answers to things can help reduce anxiety. And I know for a lot of the youth that I've had the pleasure of working with, we're not talking about knowing everything that's going to happen in the next 5 years, because that's not possible. But we can break down our planning into small chunks so that they know first we're doing this, then we're going to do that. So there's kind of a guideline of how we can get there. It can be really overwhelming to have a lot of unknown. Number 3 is that planning decreases risks. So if we don't plan and we don't really get coordinated around it, there's a risk that when a person transitions that maybe we forgot something that's really important. Maybe there was a piece of medical information that really we needed to focus on in order to have a successful transition. Or maybe there's a therapy or a service that we really can't do without. And also just workforce, who's going to work with the individual, training. So we really want to be thinking about planning, because that is what decreases risk. Planning is person-centered, and there's a lot of language about person-centered. What does that actually mean? And person-centered does really mean that the individuals we're working with are at the center of everything we're doing, including making sure that their voice is elevated during this entire process. We don't want transition to happen to individuals. We want it to happen with individuals. There's a lot of strategies and tools used around person-centered planning. There's mapping sessions where teams of people can get together and think about each little part of transition and break it down. And it's really customized. Person-centered planning is customized to the individual, to the family, to the vision that's been developed. Number 5 is planning uses resources and time wisely. So if we don't think about where we want to be when someone transitions from school, when we're developing and working with school, for example, to work through the IEP, the individual education plan, and there's a transition plan, if we haven't really thought about it, we're not wisely using our time and the skills of the school districts to make sure that instruction is really helping to gain the skills the person has identified that they'll need to get to where they want to go. At the nth hour, you don't want to realize that, oh, I really want to be an accountant, but didn't take the right levels of math to get you there. So we really want to plan and use our time and resources wisely. And the other part is that a lot of skills take time to develop. And a big part of transition is relationship development. And that does not happen overnight. It's something we have to be thinking about and happens over time. The 6 is that individuals can use resources to meet their needs. So before you get to the age of 21, there's a lot of opportunity that the area agencies, the community can offer as things to get engaged in or to move transition forward, whether that's helping a family identify respite, which is like a break for caregivers, or getting engaged in Special Olympics or unified sports, or other opportunities to build some social networks. So it's important that we can use resources now before the person's 21 to try to build some of these skills, look at opportunities and advocacy trainings and different things like that. Number 7 is that without a plan, funding will not be available. And I'll get into the funding piece of transition in a bit, but in order to project what someone's going to need at the age of 21, we have to have a plan. And a plan includes what the person needs, who's going to provide it, and how much does that cost. So that kind of addresses the transition planning for individuals. Moving into transition planning for area agencies, it's important to know that long-term funding for services in the developmental disability system is only accessible by going through an area agency system. So it's really important that you're engaged with your area agency and that we're connected as a system to families and individuals to help you think about what you need, but to also understand what the costs might be associated to that, and we have to be projecting early. So you must work with your area agency in order to receive long-term funding. Planning allows the area agency to know and project the needs of the individual. When I get into the legislator, I'll talk about those timelines, but we are asked to submit that information well in advance before a person turns 21. Our regulations ask us to start projecting those needs at the age of 16, and certainly it would need to be done well before the age of 21. So we really need to get to know that. Working with your area agency and starting transition planning is important, so we know how to project to make sure that funding is planned on at the state level, make sure there's adequate resource for transition planning. The third is collaborating ensures that skills are developed for meaningful lives. It's really important to know that when we look at transition planning, we're not just looking at what the school does now. We're not looking at what you're going to do just during the day or at night. We're looking at the whole life picture. And so we really want to make sure that we can build skills in all the areas of life, not just one or the other. We're looking at the person as a whole person. And when we collaborate by being parts of your team, whether you work with community mental health centers or vocational rehabilitation or the school district, we want to be collaborators at that table so we can understand how we can develop skills together. We also want to complete tasks at needed milestones. So the area agencies have a very good understanding of what you need to do when, so that you are in good position to receive long-term funding. That includes benefits planning, Medicaid planning, guardianship, having your levels of care identified by the state. There's so many milestones that have to be hit at certain times to have everything aligned in order to have services at the age of 21. And the area agencies are very knowledgeable about when those things need to happen, and we have the resources and supports to help move families along that process as partners. And the fifth area for area agencies is that it really outlines education areas for us. When we do transition planning, we can understand where a family is at, where an individual is at, what information we should be sharing based on what your interests are and needs. We don't want to put out blanket information that some families feel like that doesn't connect with them. We want to be able to answer questions to each individual case so we can help you get the answers you need to think about what's going to be best for you or your loved one in transition planning. And then the last area is our legislature in our state. So we are asked to project costs 4 years in advance, which means that at the age of 16, we should be putting somebody on, it's a statewide registry, which is a live document, and that our legislature is always looking out at least 4 years. So I don't want to get too confusing, but our state approves budgets in bienniums, which means 2 years at a time. So we're currently in a biennium, so our legislature is already thinking about the next 2 years. So it's really important that we have data in advance and we get that information in the registry, because they've already had their budget for this year. They're already thinking in the future. If we don't project the costs for that, then they can't make appropriations to ensure that we have enough funding. And some of you might have heard a lot of conversation about wait lists, and that's where wait lists come in. That's when people need service and there is not enough funds in our state allocated to fund all of those needs. One of the ways you can be a partner in that is to ensure you're engaged with your area agency. We have done planning, we know what your services might cost, and we can get that information to the legislature so that they can start thinking about what that will look like. And it's hard for families at age 16 to think that's in another 4 years, but for our legislature, they're always thinking that way, and that's the partnership you can do to ensure that our state can be thinking about the funding needed to support the cost. Also, transition planning decreases the cost of long-term supports. It certainly does. If we can use our education systems and in collaboration with community partners and the area agencies to work on skills, people will be best prepared to live in the community as meaningful citizens the best that they can be. And that means we can decrease costs of long-term. If someone's going to live out on their own apartment, but during all those years, we never spend any of our time working with them on budgeting and cleaning and grocery shopping and cooking meals, that means they're going to be starting at square one at the age of 21. So we want to be using our resources and our transition planning wisely, making sure we're connected to all the right systems and gaining all the skills. Our long-term supports that are funded really should be funding the gap in skills and supports that a person needs to get where they want to go. Our goal is that when we start at 16, we can identify where are the skills that need to be developed. And by the time we're getting into the 19th and 20th year, we're really saying, okay, how much skill have we gained? Where are the gaps? Because that's the types of supports we would be funding long-term. And number 4 is that transition planning, it definitely increases success and quality measures. When people have thorough transition plans that are thoughtful and intentful, and they've used all the opportunities that are available to them in this state, they report higher levels of success and report that they have a life that is really meaningful to them. And that is certainly important to our state. And number 5 is that planning helps to define the types of services needed statewide for development. So earlier I was speaking to thinking about 4 years out, the legislature wants that information. Not only are they looking at costs, but for example, they might be looking at our data for the registry to say, out of all the people needing service in the next 4 years, maybe 50% of them have autism spectrum disorder. We need to start working with our community providers and our models of service to make sure that services 4 years from now are going to meet the need of people. If half of our population experience autism at that time, do our current service models and providers have those expertise? We're always looking to do better. We don't want to be chasing trends. We want to be in front of them. So providing this information ahead of time gives our state and our area agencies and CSNI the opportunity to say, where do we need to be? How do we develop services that will meet people's needs? So this is just a nice image. I have a printout of this in my office, and it's just a real reminder to me. This is a great site if anyone's interested. It's called openfuturelearning.org. It's an advocacy program that really talks about people who experience intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities and living real lives. So as you can see in the picture, it says, I want a life, not a service. And this is absolutely what transition planning is all about. Transition planning is not transition planning from one system to another system. We are looking at the whole person as a full citizen. So it's not just the education, it's not just work, it's not just health, it's all of those things. And so we're not trying to get people into programs. Sometimes there are amazing programs that meet all the individualized needs and skills that a person wants, and that is fantastic. But we're also looking at what's outside of that. Who are the people? What's the community like? And we talk a lot about, it's easy to find people to care for someone, but who cares about someone? So at the end of the day, when mom and dad are in their 80s and their 90s, who cares about that person enough to notice that, hey, Mindy came into work today and she looked a little disheveled. Or, you know what, she's been coughing for over 4 days now. Has anyone checked in to see if she needs to go to the doctor? And we all have that in our life, and it's important during transition planning that we're not just looking at systems. We're looking at unpaid supports, natural supports, real friendships, real meaningful romantic relationships, positive opportunities to invest money and stable accounts and real futures. So when we're doing transition planning, a lot of people talk about, well, where will they go? What program? It's not about programs. Programs are a tool we use to meet needs, but we're transitioning a person to a life that is meaningful to them. And we're comparing it to a life of every other citizen in New Hampshire. So that's where you want to live, how many pets you want, how late you like to stay up night, your favorite bar, you know, whatever. So we really try to look at that, and we're looking at a wide scope of areas. All of that takes time, and it's something that has to happen well before the age of 21. So the next slide is really about, where do I begin? And the truth of it is, it's really just about a conversation, starting that conversation, engaging people, thinking globally, building relationships. That's where we begin. It starts with a conversation with maybe your area agency or your service coordinator, your school team, and then it's about really thinking and getting to those action steps. Just waiting for the slide to switch.
There you go.
Oh, it's not missing.
My bad.
There we go. So speaking of that, the tool you'll see here in this slide is called Charting the Life Course. And these tools are great because, one, they're free, which is good. And it has a lot of templates that can help you just start to give some thoughts about transition. But it's also a great demonstration about really thinking about, what do we need to think about in transition? So some of the bullets are about the areas to address during transition planning. So if you look over in this Charting the Life course, you'll see those little circles at the bottom with little images in them. And it talks about all the life domains that any citizen would be thinking about, from a meaningful day to employment, school, employment, volunteering, routines, life skills, community living, so where and how you live, housing, living options, how you'll get transportation, home modifications, thinking about safety and security. So how do we keep someone safe? What kind of protections need to be in place? What kind of training needs to be available? Where are the opportunities to advocate? Talking about some of the benefits planning. Is a guardian needed? Is there a power of attorney needed? How do we help individuals understand their rights and to advocate for them? Healthy living, managing and accessing healthcare, staying well. How are we going to manage the medical appointments? Who's their team? One of the things we think about a lot in transition is that some people use pediatric specialists. We don't want to wait until the day before they're 21 and start saying, I wonder who could serve this person, especially when you have such a great history with your specialist. Some specialists carry individuals up for a lifetime and others are pediatric, and we want to start those conversations early. But also transitioning from that role we all play as parents, I know I'm guilty of it as well, is, getting into that doctor appointment and thinking about how do I start transitioning from me running this doctor appointment to my daughter or my son running this appointment. So letting the doctor ask questions directly to the individual, have them talk about their experiences. Prep before you go to a meeting. Do you know what your medications are? Do you know why we use them? What do your pills look like? All those types of healthcare transition things are important to remember. Social and spirituality. So building friendships and relationships. And this is a really big area that the biggest marker for quality of life are the people around us, whether it's our coworkers who we spend, some of us spend 40 hours a week with more than any of our friends we ever see, as well as our friendships, our community organizations we get involved with, clubs or groups we might belong to, memberships. And then there's that citizen and advocacy, really thinking about how do I have a voice as a citizen? Am I connected to my city and town in ways that are meaningful? Does my city or town represent me well when they're making decisions, and how can I get involved in that process? So those are some really important things. When we look at transition planning, what we're talking about is that trajectory. And trajectory doesn't start at 14 or 16, it starts the day you're born. As parents, we think about what do we want for our sons and daughters in the future. And in the beginning, we as parents might define that, but as we get older, we start to include our child's dreams and wishes in that trajectory. What we hope with transition planning is that we're really focusing in that 14 and 16 range about getting there closely. But this trajectory planning really starts early. In the training we had on Charting the Life course, a great example they shared is, for example, many families will state that they want full inclusion, or an individual will say, I want to be fully included. And we think if that's what's important to a person, we value that completely. And so way back when the person starts school at age 3, perhaps, and we talk about transportation, a family might say, well, they would need specialized transportation. I want the bus to pick them up right at the home. I don't want them on the bus with all those kids. It'll be really overwhelming. What if they get upset? What if this happens? And so at that time, the team makes a decision to use specialized transportation that is maybe 2 or 3 students, and they pick them up right at the home. So the question is, how does that move us towards or away our trajectory of inclusion? Because inclusion would mean using the same bus that all members of the community use. And that's not to say that we wouldn't use specialized transportation for a period of time, but as a team, we want to be talking about how do we fade that support over time to get back onto our trajectory towards full inclusion. And so it's funny because it's the little tiny things we did at the age of 3 that we didn't realize that, hey, guess what, in another 18 years, that could have really made an impact to where we are. One of the things we see a lot of is we meet with families transition age and they're like, oh, we don't know anybody. My family would never be able to watch my son or daughter. We don't talk to anybody. We don't go anywhere socially. And building relationships, not just for the individual, but for families is really important. We all have to have support networks. You have to take care of the caregiver. We know that 80% of people stay with their families well past the age of 21 for periods of time, but families will need support to do that. Family to family support is so important, but also just getting involved and getting engaged, because parents will not live forever. And so when families pass on, are there enough people in their life that met them over their lifetime who's going to really be invested and take care of them? The things I talked about earlier, knowing when their birthday is and their favorite color frosting and which t-shirt they like to wear on Thursdays, and just the little stuff that makes us all human. We have to build that social capital, and that doesn't happen by staying home. And I'm not suggesting it's easy and not hard for families, but when you do that, you can really have some success. I work with a family I've been with a long time, and they told us every person that ever interacted with our kid, whether it was the dentist or the paraeducator or the school or a respite provider or someone that they hired to work with them, we looked at them as the potential future person in our life. In this family, for example, they host an alumni barbecue every summer, and they invite anybody who has ever touched their kid. And it is a cast of characters, let me tell you. But we are just a weird family that have come together that is non-traditional over the commitment we made to these kids. And that was because the family knew from the get-go that they could not do this alone. And at the end of the day, when they pass, there's going to be a line of us that are fighting over who's actually going to be in charge. So that's a good problem to have. But if they did not have that attitude, that could potentially leave them as a vulnerable place. They sleep at night knowing that when they pass, there are people that love those kids just as much as they do, and they can rest easy knowing that any decision someone else has to help make in the future of their kids is going to be well done, because they knew them and they understood the importance. And that has to happen early, and we can support families in transition planning to think about that. Transition planning is not all about the school. It's not all about VR. It's not all about the area agency. It's not about all paid supports. I hire people to do the things I'm not good at. You do not want me to change your oil. I'll tell you that right now. So I hire somebody to do that. But, you know, my 17-year-old son, he can change the oil on any vehicle. So he's not going to buy a paid support for that. Our whole lives are not paid supports. They're real lives, and we want to be thinking about that. So that's what trajectory planning is really all about, thinking about it early and moving in that direction. So then it gets into, how does the area agency support transition? So the fun thing and the difficult thing is that every area agency has different ways to get involved. And the reason being is that we are designed to be locally serving the citizens in our area, which means that we might have differences in the what and how our families need to receive services depending on what's going on in our communities. But there are things that we all do. All area agencies support families to do transition planning, and there are different ways that we do things. But this slide is really about the things all of us do. And I do encourage you to engage with your area agency, your service coordinator, your family support department from your area agency to really learn about how your area agency supports transition. Today I'll talk more globally, but certainly those targeted questions specifically to your area agency are good questions for your service coordinator and their team. So the first I talk about, I always put it first, even though it's not always the priority to me, but funding, right? You got to have money to pay for things. And so that's what we're doing. I think it's important to know that even though I might know a family and I've met with them a bunch of times, if I haven't had a targeted conversation with that family and they haven't really advocated for what they're comfortable asking for in long-term services, I can't just enter into the state registry what I think is a good idea for the family as a professional working for the area agency. It's tempting if I can't get a hold of a family to do that, because I'm very worried that they won't be represented in that funding need if I don't hear from them. But it's really important that we are connected so that we can help answer those questions. We can give you the tools you'll need to explore what services and providers of service already exist out in the community. How could you maybe create something more individualized if your needs can't be met in the certain models? We have different models of service that allow for maximum choice and control. That's how the area agencies can help you with funding. But at the end of the day, we really need to work with families to understand what you want, how it needs to be supported, how it meets the needs of the disability, and what that overall costs are. We do this every day. I have to remind families when they are in the woes of transition is coming. We transition people every single day in the area agency system. And We have many, many, many successes. And whenever there's a stumbling block, we just pick ourselves up and we move forward. That's life. That's what happens to everybody. Every day people transition and it's done and it's fine. And your transition will be fine too. But funding is an important part of transition planning. And it's also not just the area agency funding, but also helping you understand how we can get you connected to other funding sources for different needs your family might have, such as vocational rehabilitation or grant opportunities that we know about, different community resources or state funding that can help pay for things such as food stamps and different systems. So we can really help with that. The other part is that person-centered planning that we talked about. All the things that I've been talking about, that trajectory planning, it sounds great when you talk about it as a philosophy, but it really requires somebody who can map that out and facilitate that process for families. Our roles as area agency is not to make decisions. It's about helping families and individuals brainstorm and talk about different ways things could get done, and to make action plans that we can share so that we can collaborate with, whether it's the school or community or family. I have worked with families before, and the goal, we all know the goal is to work in the culinary field, and the school's doing culinary, and we were all talking about it. And then we say, how often do you cook at home? And they're like, oh, never. And I'm like, never? We're going to be working on cooking as a career. We got to be cooking at home too. So how can we all work together to make those things happen? And we can facilitate those steps. We're happy to engage partners. We're all trained in it. It's hard to do person-centered planning when you're personally involved. So it's always helpful sometimes to have someone else to help you through that process. And area agencies offer that support in different ways. We sometimes do individual work. Sometimes we work in collaboration with the school team to have like a transition planning meeting at the school. Other area agencies and ourselves as well have information nights where they'll talk about person-centered planning, get you a chance to come in and do some tools together in groups with other families. So that's always a nice option too, so that you can network. We also understand and know benefits planning. So managing benefits and other programs you have access to can be a very challenging process. And the area agencies can walk family through benefits. And when I talk about benefits, I'm talking about Medicaid. It's important to know that in order to receive long-term funding, every individual has to have New Hampshire Medicaid. And it has to be a Medicaid that also has a disability determination portion of the eligibility. So there's a state plan Medicaid, which is more based solely on fiscal. But for our population, we're looking at specialized Medicaid programs specific to our population that not only looks at the fiscal requirements, but they're looking to make sure that the person's disability meets a certain level of care need, which makes you eligible to receive long-term funding. We understand that system. We also have very strong connections with the New Hampshire Medicaid statewide system and the regional offices, as well as resources of people who specialize in benefits planning with families. Not exclusively, but for example, Granite State Independent Living. We can make some of those connections and collaborations so that you can get all the questions. Benefits planning also includes Social Security. It can also include thinking about guardianship. Stable accounts are something newer to our state, which allows an individual with a disability to have some allowable expenses and save more money than what's allowed in Medicaid or Social Security without impacting their benefits. So those are things that we can and should be talking about. How does that add to the meaningful life of the individual we're supporting? So we can talk about lots of benefits and different benefits other families might have, special needs trusts and how to manage that. We don't provide legal advice, but we can connect you to people who have expertise in that area. So it's important to be thinking about that. The area agencies are also very connected to our community. It is our responsibility to know the players in our communities, how things work, their different systems, so that we can refer families to the right places and get people engaged. When you look at a school district, a lot of times people expect the school case managers to know all the community stuff. Well, their actual job is to educate. So let us help with the community stuff. They'll do the education during the day and we'll get to know the community stuff so we can pair education and community together. But we typically know who all the players are. We also know a lot of people who have adaptive programs or inclusive programs that can meet particular care needs, alternative therapy options that other families have used. The benefit we have is that the area agencies are educated every single day by every family this system serves. So in my region, we serve 3,400 people, and every day those families give me the blessing of education. Hey, I use this adaptive swim class and I love, love, love this instructor. That's really helpful because 3 years from now, someone's going to say, I really want my son to learn how to swim, but I think he needs specialized instruction. That little tidbit stays in my brain because it's attached to a person. And now I can pass that word on to someone else. We can also connect people to new resources, or ABA therapists and different resources like that. So it's really important that we can help you connect with community resources. The fifth bullet here is about education. So we can educate individuals and families about their rights, about what they can expect in different systems. We can talk about the different models of support. So using vendor organization or provider networks. How do you do a participant-directed managed service? How do you direct your own services? What are different residential options? What are different employment supports? What do they look like? How do they work? In transition, people know the school system. By the time you're 16 to 21, you really got the school system down. But at 21, the school is not going to be there anymore. So it's a new system families have to learn, and we are here to be that person walking not in front of you, but walking beside you or behind you to support you to understand how those systems work. It's very hard to make decisions when you don't know systems or you don't have the information you need to make a sound decision, and these are big decisions, and we respect that. We can talk about advocacy, the role of it, how to teach it, to practice it, when you should be advocating, opportunities to advocate. Area agencies, we send out a lot of information about different bills that are impacting our Senate or are in front of our Senate or our House, the state budget, how much money is being allocated to fund people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We are very educated in the individual education plan process. We can connect you with the Parent Information Center and New Hampshire Family Voices to understand your individual education plan. We can help families look at the plans that are being presented to them, understand what does the language mean, what does the sections mean, what should I be thinking about. We have different tools to educate people. We offer a lot of webinars. We offer a lot of in-person sessions on different topics. I know in our region we have fact sheets that are based on age that say, okay, congratulations, you're 16. Here's what you should be thinking about in the next year. Let our service coordinator work with you to work through some of these issues. But we have all the resource lists. We know who's who and where to go for different things, and we can help be that voice for you. We also wrap around individuals. So we support individuals who some have very high intensive needs, and that could be very severe, significant medical needs that we need to really wrap our providers, all of the medical, the education, the mental health, and the developmental family needs all together. So we can be that person who can bring in all those players at the same table and help facilitate those conversations so that we can make sure that a person is wrapped around and that you're not working with 6 different people all doing kind of the different things. And that kind of leads us to this last area, which is collaboration. The area agencies cannot do everything on their own, and we have fantastic opportunities and services in our state, and it's our blessing to be able to be partners at those tables and to work together as part of teams. We know schools, we know mental health, community mental health providers, families and friends, and how do we pull those players together so we can ensure that we're all working on the same things, complementing each other's work versus working in silos or competing with each other's work. It's important that we can make sure that we're all in that coordinated set of events, which is really what transition planning is. So
Mindy, that was a great overview of the transition process. And I know we have some questions from our audience that we're going to get to now. Just real quick, even before we get into the Q&A, can you talk a little bit about how the people who help with transition planning either continue on with someone's, as part of someone's team when they enter adult services, or do they drop off, or is there a handoff?
Sure.
How does that work?
It's a great question. Each area agency kind of handles that differently, which means that for some people, transition is done by the service coordinator they've had since they were 3 or whoever's currently assigned with them. And other area agencies have one specialist that really specializes in transition. So they work just with families, which means Some area agencies have children's service coordinators and adult service coordinators, so there could be a transition over. And that's why it's so important to engage with your individual area agency to really understand how is transition provided. But to also know that your voice is important. So you talking about what really works for your family is helpful for your area agency to know. You know, in my region, we have children's service coordinators and adult service coordinators. So we do all the transition planning. And then in that 20th year, we start to introduce the new team and do things together until we have kind of a smooth handoff. But we kind of go at the pace of which is working for a family. And families always have the right to request their service coordinator. So it's important to know that it is your right. It's great to have a service coordinator that knows your family, but it's also great to have a service coordinator that is very knowledgeable in the lifespan in that you're working with. So there are pros and cons to having a person who specializes in children's service coordination stay with you lifelong, because they might not have as much knowledge base as an adult service coordinator once you get over 21, but that's not always true in every case. So yeah, there can be transitions while you're transitioning. So it's a good question.
So if I have a child who's in the school system, and my child has an IEP, can I have somebody from the transition team come over and be part of the IEP process, or
Yep.
be working at that point?
Absolutely. So we kind of use the term service coordination, which is service coordinators are similar to a case manager or whoever your point person is at the area agency. And that's something we hope families will include us in, because we learn a lot from those processes. We can understand how the student and individual is as a learner, what kind of works with them. We can see the team dynamics, and that really is helpful to us, because at the end of the day, that school program that's known your child so intimately isn't going to be there. So it's great for us to be at those IEP meetings so we can do transition together. What we don't want to happen is come into those meetings and say, here's the transition plan. We created it outside of the school and now you're going to implement it. That is not how transition works. Transition is really about having that shared vision and working together to say, how are we all going to make these steps towards transition? Yes, the school is required by law to have transition plan formally written out in their individual education plans at the latest starting at age 16, but it's also about the whole community and looking at that bigger picture. So it's about collaboration. Area agencies are not advocates, so we will not go into an IEP and say, you will do this, you won't do that. That's not our role. Our role is education and collaboration, so we can educate families and we can ask questions for the teams to consider. And our goals is that we can work collaboratively. Educators are brilliant, skilled individuals, and they want to see success for students. They have that investment, and sometimes they need information that an area agency might have to help them understand that vision. So yes, we should be going to school meeting, IEP meetings. And
So if I feel like my school district is not sort of doing enough in terms of the transition planning, what are my options there if the area agency can't advocate?
Yeah, we're not there as advocates, but what we would like to do is kind of understand, where are your concerns? What is the current education, the individual education treatment plan? Does it seem to align? And really getting some information. But we would really refer people to the Parent Information Center or the Disability Rights Center if families really felt like their rights were being violated, or that they weren't, the school was stating that that's not something they provided, and they really felt strongly that it was something that should be as outlined in New Hampshire special education law. We would refer people to the Parent Information Center or the Disability Rights Center. There are educational advocates that families can hire. It does come out of pocket. So it's important to know it is very costly, and the educational advocates are very skilled and very educated. Our hope and what we found is, even when there has been adversarial kind of situations, by using understanding and a common vision and respect, we can usually draw all the members into a shared vision and try to say, okay, what's in it for them, and maybe what's their hesitancy? How can we maybe compromise, or how can we together support different things? And we can often find that just a little bit of work at developing the team relationship can solve a lot of those concerns. But at the end of the day, advocacy is sometimes needed, and there are venues in the state to provide that.
That's great. I've sometimes heard families talk about this sort of, the cliff of, age 21, right? And or how things can change when their child is ready to exit the school system. Maybe they've earned a diploma, or they're aging out of the school system. And it certainly sounds like transition planning, if it's done well, can help reduce that feeling like there's this big abyss that people go into after
Exactly.
the end of school.
One of the things that I've been really grateful for is that in our collaborations with schools and families, when we've had a clear transition plan, sometimes we can start some of those transition pieces early. So we might be able to start thinking, if your child receives extended school year, instead of going to, maybe a camp program that the school's always supported to send, can we maybe start using that provider, which sometimes is known as a vendor or a provider of service, early? So could we, instead of going to the camp we've always gone to, because next, in 4 months, you're going to be transitioning into this vendor, could we use them now to provide some service? And that's not a guarantee for every situation, but many times parts of the transition for adult life can happen sooner. And we can get some of those things happening. So by the time of 21, sometimes it could just be a funding flick behind the scenes that nobody feels if we can coordinate a transition. And that most often happens for people who have very intensive needs, kiddos who might be in a school placement residentially, and they have intensive needs, and they're going to be transitioning into maybe a residential program as well as a community participation program with the area agencies. Sometimes we can have conversations with the schools and teams to say, can we start using this adult team sooner? And again, that is very individualized, but it shouldn't be this start clear cliff that you're jumping over. When we transition plan, people should know what is happening. We've introduced parts of it as early as we can. And yes, there will be some changes, but it shouldn't be kind of a light switch. It should be something that happens gradually over time. Including changing healthcare providers. We don't want to be transitioning someone to a brand new day program at the same time as we are looking for a new medication provider. We want to have all those things stable ahead of time so that if there are some challenges, we have a team who is comfortable. We don't want all the parts changing at the same time, and that's what that coordination is about. When do we need to do things, and what do we need to do?
That's great. Well, this has been really, really incredibly helpful. I think we actually were able to get to whatever questions that were sent in from our audience. So we have one more here. So, okay, so here's a question from somebody who's wondering, how do they find out, who their area agency is and whether or not their child qualifies for such an agency, and how do they find that information out?
Sure. So if you're not sure, just make sure everyone on the webinar understands. So the area agency system, or a designation by the Bureau of Developmental Services and the Department of Health and Human Services to provide services to individuals with intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, and acquired brain disorders throughout our state. We are identified in regions, and you can go to the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services website and put in area agencies. Up will come a nice page that will have a region list by town, as well as a map, so you can see which region. It has their contact information and the name of the area agency. We all have our own little names, but we're all area agencies. There's 10 of us. So that's the place to start to know who is your area agency. As far as eligibility, there is an actual process to go through. But when we're looking at eligibility around developmental disability, including intellectual disability, acquired brain disorders, which are typically identified as an injury that happens to the brain after the age of 22. So for children, even if you have a brain injury, it's really considered developmental disability because it happened in the developmental years. So they're looking at that. In New Hampshire, we don't have a set IQ score. I know that's a common practice in other states. We don't have that philosophy here, though intellectual functioning is a part of determination. We have many people that have very, very high IQs, but have deficits based on their disability that are more around social skills or executive functioning that might qualify them. Mm-hmm. And really what we're looking for in eligibility is an overall delay in functioning that impedes parts of a person's life, from social to academic to employment and independent living, at a significant rate. And so it's the definition is also available on the DHS website as well, that I mentioned earlier. The process is actually, fairly simple. It's about connecting with the intake coordinator at your area agency. There's some information we need collected, which includes kind of that medical diagnosis, any assessments you have, the individual education plan, if you had those types of things, and that all gets submitted for eligibility. But those determinations are usually made within 2 weeks per our regulations. So it's not a process that you're going to wait 4 or 5 months to get a determination. You're going to know within a short period of time. On occasion, if the family's trying to get another assessment, we can mutually agree to extend that time frame. But for the most part, within a 14-day window, we can let you know about that eligibility. And once you're eligible, that's when you would be assigned to a service coordinator, and that person would meet with you to understand what your family's needs are. This question, the person stated their daughter was 16. So I know when eligibility comes into my region and I look and they're 16, that's an immediate flag to me. And I make sure their service coordinator is going to jump right in and talk about, understand the family, get to know where they're at, but to start that transition planning, because we want to get that projection. So we can jump in at any time. It's preferred if people come into eligibility early. And the other part is that transition planning is great, but we want families to engage with the area agency as soon as the disability is identified, because there's so much we can do along the way. It's not just about 21. It's about helping families get connected right away.
So the other, just the other resource that might be helpful to that listener today is that, the school districts, special ed departments should definitely be familiar with who the area agency is that is responsible for services in that town. And lastly, the CSNI website also has easy to use tools to find out what, we have the same, the list of towns by region and a little locator tool on there. So if you go to csni.org, you can find that under our agencies. We had one more, I think we have time for one more question, and just sort of at a high level. So if somebody's been working with a transition coordinator and they're let's say they're in the Nashville area and they are working with a transition coordinator, but they're planning to move to another part of the state. What's the process like at a high level for them to be able to switch to another region?
Sure.
Do they switch to another region, or how does that work?
So individuals that are determined eligible by any area agency, that eligibility stays with you no matter where you move inside of the state of New Hampshire. So maybe I became eligible when I lived in Nashua, but then when I was 18, I moved to Portsmouth. So I don't have to start over with eligibility. So that's important to know. But if we're doing transition planning and you're thinking you're going to move when you are 22, we kind of have to have that conversation with that family to say, what is that going to look like? Are we establishing services here? Are we exploring services in another area? So transfers can happen amongst regions. They typically don't happen until a person is actually moved to that area. But if we knew it was in a short period of time, and we have had this happen, we would just collaborate with that other area agency to understand what their resources are. We may determine as two area agencies and the family that we are going to move, transfer the case to have a service coordinator in that area. But technically, as far as getting your funding coordinated and as far as getting that plan and all those things in place, that the area agency in the town you live in is actually responsible to do all that planning, unless we agree mutually we're going to transfer the case ahead of time. So we would work collaboratively, and we do work in our regions, but we see each other regularly. We work in ways to be uniformed across the state. So it's certainly possible. Is it easiest to get transition services in the town you're going to live in? Of course it is, because that area agency knows your community way better than what another region would know. But it is possible. We would just work collaboratively to know that. But again, that's where that person-centered piece comes in, is what works for this family and how do we figure it out? Oftentimes with families, I'm doing a transition plan for when they're 21. But then once they're 21, we don't just say, well, you're 21, good, have a good life. We're always saying, does this still make sense? What's next for this family? And though your transition has happened into adult services, every day in the services you're receiving we're constantly asking you, does this still make sense? What's next? What information does your family need for other transitions in life, to employment or to maybe another town? So it's an ongoing question. Your services are never static. They never stay exactly the same. They're always supposed to be thinking about, does this still make sense? What else do we need? Maybe we don't need this anymore, but we need something else. So that's how services are designed.
Well, Mindy, we're really excited that you were able to join us today and provide such an in-depth look at the transition process. And to all of our viewers and listeners out there, thank you for tuning in. We're just about out of time, and I just have a couple of quick announcements before we end the webinar today. The first is that we are going to be sending out a brief survey at the end of the webinar to everybody who registered. So we would really appreciate if you would take a minute to just fill out that survey and send it back to us. We do use those responses to help us plan future webinar topics, as well as to just identify any areas where we can improve the overall delivery of information to you, our listeners, and our viewers. The other thing I wanted to mention is the two webinars that we have coming up. Tuesday, March 19th, we will have a presentation by the Brain Injury Association of New Hampshire, which will be just an overview of brain injury and brain injury services in our state. And April 2nd, we are excited to have back our frequent guests, Judith Baumster and Ann Butenhoff, who are going to be joined by Chuck Saya and Bill Dwyer, who are the administrators of the Stable New Hampshire program and have been on our webinar series before. And they're going to jointly present in a panel style on how you can integrate the use of special needs trusts in stable accounts. So it should be pretty interesting. And hopefully we are all set with camera work and technology so that our viewers and listeners can enjoy the experience. So. But again, thank you all for joining. Please respond to the email with the survey. And Mindy, thank you again for sharing your time and information with us today.
Thanks for having me.